Take that, YouTube. I have conquered your landscaping abilities. Hello, everyone. If you do listen live and you can't hear me, just shout. I can never get the sound right on these things. I brought the camera a little closer. See if that helps. I've got some traditional Korean in the background. I hope it's not too loud. I could try and make it quieter. Is that too quiet? That'll have to do, I'm afraid. It's probably better that you can hear what I'm saying. Alright, Chapter 2. I won't faff around too much, we'll just get straight into it. Chapter 2. A Dangerous History. La histoire, la dangereuse. I don't know why I tried to say that in French. I think my father would have become a millionaire if he had grown up in South Korea or the United States. But he was born in North Korea, where family connections and party loyalty are all that matter. And hard work guarantees you nothing but more hard work and a constant. Park in Sik was born in the industrial port city of Hamhung on March the 4th, 2 days before my birthday, 1962. Into a military family with good political connections. This should have given him a great advantage in life because in all North Korea, all of your opportunities by your caste, the caste system still, or Songbun. When Kim Il Sung came to power after World War II, he upended the traditional feudal system that divided people into landlords, peasants, nobility, and commoners, priests, and scholars. He ordered background checks on every citizen to find out everything about them and their families, going back generations. In the Songbun system, everyone is ranked among three based on their supposed loyalty to the regime. The highest class is the Corps class, made up of honoured revolutionaries, peasants, veterans, or relatives of those who fought or died in the north, and those who have demonstrated a great loyalty to the Kim family. And are second is the basic or wavering class, made up of those who once lived in the south or had family there, former merchants. Finally, last of all, is the hostile class. This includes former landowners and their descendants, capitalists. How do you determine that? Former South Korean soldiers, Christians, or other religious followers. This is because in a communist system, religion is seen as an opiate of the masses. You know, it's there to keep the proletariat from rising up, murdering the bourgeoisie. You see, it's what stops the poor from murdering the rich. But you know, it's a very narrow-minded view. It's perfect if you want to kill some rich people. Sorry, 2 seconds. The families of political prisoners and any other perceived enemies of the state. It is extremely difficult to move to a higher Songbun, but it is very easy to be cast down into the lowest levels through no fault of your own. And as my father and his family found out, once you lose your Songbun status, you lose everything else you have achieved along with it. My father's father, Park Chang-yu, grew up in the countryside near Haesan when Korea was a Japanese colony. For more than 4,000 years, there's been one Korean people, but many different Koreas. Legend tells us that our history began in 2333 BC, with a kingdom called Chosun, which means morning land. Despite its soothing name, my homeland has rarely been peaceful. The Korean peninsula lay at the crossroads of great empires, and over the centuries, Korean kingdoms had to fight off invaders from Manchuria to Mongolia and beyond. In the century, the expanding Japanese Empire slowly absorbed Korea using threats and treaties, finally annexing the whole country in 1910. That was 2 years before the birth of North Korea's first leader, Kim Il sung, and 11 years before my grandfather Park was born. The Japanese were despotic colonial rulers who tried to destroy Korean culture and turn us into second-class citizens of our own land. They outlawed the Korean language and took over our farms and industries. This behavior sparked nationalist resistance to Japanese rule that was met with violent suppression. Like many Koreans, Kim Il sung's parents moved the family across the northern border to Manchuria, which was then part of the Chinese Empire. After the Japanese invaded Manchuria in the early 1930s, our future great leader joined a guerrilla group fighting the Japanese occupiers. But at the outset of World War II, Kim Il sung joined the Soviet army. And as I later learned, contrary to North Korean propaganda, which has him almost single-handedly fighting the Japanese, spent the war at a military base far from the fighting. That sounds about right to me. You need an education to be a communist. Of course, I use the word education there very lightly. When I was growing up, we didn't talk about what our families did during those times. In North Korea, any history can be dangerous. What I know about my father's side of the family comes from the few stories my father told my mother. At the start of World War II, Grandfather Park was working for Japanese managers in the finance department of Haesan's administrative office, or City Hall. It was there that he met his future wife, Jung Hae-soon, who was also working at the City Hall. She was an orphan who had been raised by her aunt, and she'd had a very hard life before she'd met my grandfather. The courtship was unusual, because unlike so many Korean couples whose marriages are arranged by their parents, my grandparents actually knew and liked each other before their wedding. My father kept his civil service job all through World War II. After the Japanese surrendered on August the 15th, 1945, the Soviet army swept into the northern part of Korea, while the American military took charge of the south, and this set the stage for the agony my country has endured for more than 70 years. An arbitrary line was drawn along the 38th parallel, dividing the peninsula into two administrative zones, North and South Korea. The United States flew an anti-communist exile named Syngman Rhee into Seoul and ushered him in power as the first president of the Republic of Korea. Many anti-communists were exiled from Korea, the ones that weren't killed. In the north, Kim Il sung. Because you see, this was obviously before the Kim dynasty, because you do exile people during the Kim dynasty. You do shoot them because anybody who leaves, of course, can give information out. So it was the Russians began to exile, mostly to Siberia, but out of the country after Stalin's death. Their exiles were sort of out of the country for X many years. I think it was still during Stalin's time, maybe near the end, or it was after. The periods just after something new is instated, or just after something falls, are very chaotic periods, and it's hard to completely know what goes on in those times. But you can assume a lot of it is bad, because it's a lawless situation. Anyway, there's your first president of the Republic of Korea. That'll be the South, Syngman Rhee. In the north, Kim Il sung, who had by then become a Soviet major, was installed as leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK. The Soviets quickly rounded up all eligible men to establish a North Korean military force. My grandfather was taken from his job at City Hall and turned into an officer in the People's Army. By 1949, both the United States and the Soviet Union had withdrawn their troops and turned the peninsula over to the new puppet leaders. It did not go well. Kim Il sung was a Stalinist and an ultra nationalist dictator who decided to reunify the country in the summer of 1950 by invading the South Korean with Russian tanks and thousands of troops. In North Korea, we were told that the Yankee imperialists started the war, and our soldiers gallantly fought off their evil invasion. In fact, the United States military returned to Korea for the express purpose of defending the South, because we did leave in '49, and the war wasn't for 2 years until for 2 years. So the Yanks came back, and the British came back as well. My grandfather was in that war. Okay, so the military returned to Korea for the express purpose of defending the South, bolstered by an official United Nations force, and quickly drove Kim Il sung's army all the way to the Yalu River, nearly taking over the country, when they were stopped only when the Chinese soldiers surged across the border and fought the Americans back to the 38th parallel. By the end of this senseless war, at least 3 million Koreans had been killed or wounded. Millions were refugees, and most of the country was in ruins. In 1953, both sides agreed to end the fighting, but they never signed a peace treaty. To this day, we are still officially at war. The governments of North Korea and South believe they are the legitimate representatives of all Koreans. Grandfather Park was a financial officer and never fired a shot during the Korean War. After the armistice, he remained in the military, traveling with his family from post to post. He was based in Hamhung, about 180 miles south of Hyesan, when my father was born. The fourth of 5 children and the youngest son. Later, when my grandfather retired from active duty, the government resettled him and his family in Hyesan. My grandfather's position as an officer and a member of the ruling Workers' Party of Korea gave him good Songbun status, and he was awarded another job as a finance manager at the commissary that supplied goods to military families. At least for a while, the family prospered along with North Korea's growing economy. During the 1950s and 60s, China and the Soviet Union poured money into North Korea to help it rebuild. The North has coal and minerals in its mountains, and it was always the richer, more industrialized part of the country. It bounced back much more quickly than the South, which was still mostly agricultural and slow to recover from the war. But that started to change in the 1970s and the 1980s, as South Korea became a manufacturing center, and North Korea's Soviet-style system collapsed under its own weight. The economy was centrally planned and completely controlled by the state. There was no private property, at least officially, and all the farms were collectivized, although the people could grow some vegetables to sell in small, highly controlled markets. The government provided all jobs, paid everyone's salary, and distributed rations for most food and consumer goods. While my parents were growing up, the distribution system was still subsidized by the Soviet Union and China, so few people were starving. But nobody outside the elite really prospered. At the same time, supply wasn't meeting demand for the kinds of items people wanted, like imported clothing, electronics, special foods. While the favoured classes had access to many of these goods through government-run department stores, the prices were usually too high for most people to afford. Any ordinary citizen who fancied foreign cigarettes or alcohol, or Japanese-made handbags, would have to buy them on the black market. The usual route for those goods was from the north through China. My father went into the military sometime around 1980. When he was in his late teens, like most North Korean men from the middle and upper classes, he was conscripted for 10 years of service. Wow. thought it's two it was two in England. Bloody hell. Although with connections, that could be reduced to little as two. Wow. But less than a year after my father joined the army, he got very sick with a burst appendix. After 4 or 5 surgeries to control complications from the infection, his military service was over for good. This could have been a catastrophe for him, because North Korean men without military backgrounds are usually shy of the best jobs. Excuse me. But when he returned to Haesan with nothing to do, his father suggested he study finance. He was able to enroll in a 3-year program at the Haesan Economic College. The rest of the family was also doing well. My father's older brother, Park Jin, was attending medical school in Haesan, and his eldest brother, Park Dong-il, was a middle school teacher in Hamhung. His older sister had married and moved to Pyongyang, where she worked as a waitress, and his little sister was attending school in Haesan. But disaster struck in 1980 when Dong-il, that was his eldest brother, was accused of raping one of his students and attempting to kill his wife. I never learned all the details of what happened, or even if the charges were true, but he ended up being sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. It was only because of grandfather Park's connections he escaped execution. It is common for non-political prisoners to be released from prison before they die, to save the government the trouble of sending their bodies home. So after serving 12 years, Dong-il was let out on sick leave and he returned to Haesan. Nobody in the family ever spoke about his past. I remember him as a frail and quiet man who was always kind to me. He died when I was still a little girl. In North Korea, if one member of a family commits a serious crime, everybody is considered a criminal. Suddenly, my father's family lost its favorable social and political status. There are more than 50 subgroups within the main Songbun caste, so once you become an adult, your status is constantly being monitored and adjusted by the authorities. A network of casual neighborhood informants and official police surveillance ensures that nothing you do or your family does goes unnoticed. Everything about you is recorded and stored in local administrative offices and in big national organizations. And the information is used to determine where you can live, where you can go to school, and where you can work. With a superior Songbun, you can join the Workers' Party, which gives you access to political power. You can go to a good university and get a good job. With a poor one, you can end up on a collective farm chopping rice paddies for the rest of your life, and in times of famine, starving to death. All of Grandfather Park's connections could not save his career, after his eldest son was convicted of attempted murder. He was fired from his job at the commissariat shortly after Dong-il was sent to prison, although no official reason was given for his dismissal. Fortunately, his younger sons were less affected by the scandal and managed to complete their educations. My uncle Park Jin finished medical school and became a professor at Haesan Medical University and later became administrator at the medical college. He was an excellent student and a clever political player who managed to succeed despite his family's problems. My father earned his degree in economic planning, and like his father before him, was hired to work in the finance office in Haesan's City Hall. But only after a year, there was a restructuring of the administrative offices and he lost his job. His poor Songbun finally caught up with him. My father realized he would have no future unless he found a way to join the Workers' Party. He decided to become a laborer at a local metal foundry where he could work hard and prove his loyalty to the regime. He was able to build good relationships with the people who held power at his workplace, including the party representatives there. Before long, he had his membership. By that time, my father had also started a side business to make some extra money. This was a bold move, because any business venture outside of state control was illegal. but my father was unusual in that he had a natural and entrepreneurial spirit, and what some might call a healthy contempt for the rules. He also had the luck of being living at the right time in the right part of the country to turn his business into a big success, at least for a while. Heisan had already been a long established tradition of cross border trade with China, and a small but lively black market for everything, from dried fish to electronics. During the 1980s, women were allowed to sell food and handicrafts at makeshift markets, but general trading was still an underground and specialised activity. My father joined a small but growing class of black market operators who found ways to exploit cracks in the state controlled economy. He started small. My father discovered he could buy a carton of top quality cigarettes for 70 to 100 won on the black market in Hyesan, then sell each cigarette for 7 to 10 won in the North Korean interior. At that time, a kilogram, 2.2 pounds of rice, cost around 25 won, so cigarettes were obviously very valuable. The government had placed more restrictions on travel in North Korea. There was a lot of paperwork involved in travelling out of town. First, my father needed permission to leave the factory where he worked. He would negotiate a fee with the doctor to write him a note saying he was sick. Then he would tell his supervisor he needed to go out of town for a few days for treatment. The supervisor would issue him papers. Then my father would go to the police and bribe them for a travel permit. My father travelled by train to small cities where there were not big black markets. He hid the cigarettes in his bags, all over his body, and in every pocket. He had to keep moving to avoid being searched by the police, who were always looking for contraband. Sometimes the police discovered him and confiscated the cigarettes, or threatened to hit him with a metal stick if he didn't turn over his money. My father had to convince the police that it was in everybody's interest to let him make a profit so that he could keep coming back and giving them cigarettes as bribes. Often they agreed. He was a born salesman. Although I knew he would have preferred a safer and more conventional life as a high government official, that was never to be his fate. Almost anywhere else, business would have been my father's vocation. But in North Korea, it was simply a means to survive, and it made him an outlaw. Chapter 3. Swallows and the Magpie. My father's business began with cigarettes and soon grew to include Chinese-made clothes, a product in high demand. In the summer of 1989, he travelled to Kowon, a small city near North Korea's east coast, to sell his goods, and while in town, stopped to visit his friend Byeon Min-sik, another ambitious young man whom my father had known in Hyesan. It was there that my father met his friend's younger sister, Keum-suk, my mother. She was 4 years younger than my father, and her songbun status was just as poor as his, though also through no fault of her own. While my father had to struggle because his brother was in prison, she was considered untrustworthy because her paternal grandfather had owned land when Korea was a Japanese colony. The stigma passed down through 3 generations, and when my mother was born, in 1966, she was already considered a member of the hostile class and was barred from the privileges of the elite. This is a hostile baby. It's mad, isn't it? But that's how it was. That's how it still is. My mother's father, Baeon Ruk, came from North Hamgyong province in the northern part of Korea. His family wasn't very wealthy, but they owned just enough property to be considered landlords. By the time my grandfather Baeon was born in 1931, the family had already lost their money. That was the same year that Japan decided to expand its empire by invading and occupying the 3 Chinese provinces that make up Manchuria, just north of the Korean border. Hundreds of thousands of ethnic Koreans had already settled in Manchuria, and the border was notoriously porous. When Japan occupied both regions in the 30s and 40s, it was even easier to travel back and forth. In 1933, when my grandfather Byeon was 2 years old, Byeon, Baeon, I fuck knows. The whole family moved to Honshu in China, just across the Tumen River from Hamyong. When World War II broke out, he was still a schoolboy, but he ended up in the fighting. My mother never knew which army he belonged to because my grandfather never spoke of it. After the war ended, he remained in China but often visited his North Korean homeland. When he was 22, right before the North Korean War began in 1950, he made a visit to Onsong, a border town where his father had once owned property. There he met a group of men who were on their way to the Soviet Union to work as loggers. He joined them for dinner, and they kept buying rounds of drinks. Finally, he left them to walk back alone to the inn, but he was so drunk that he lay down on the railroad tracks and fell asleep. My grandfather woke up the next day in Onsong Hospital with an arm and a leg missing, and no idea how he got there. He was told that a train had run over him while he slept, and he'd survived only because a railroad monitor found him and brought him to a doctor. Jesus Christ. Grandfather Baeon was remained in North Korea to heal. His arm was completely gone, but enough of his leg remained that he was fitted with a prosthetic limb and learned to walk without crutches. By the time he recovered, the Korean War was ending. In fact, the devastating injury might have saved his life, because he almost would have certainly ended up fighting in a conflict that claimed more than 3 million lives. The United States dropped more bombs on North Korea than it had during the entire Pacific campaign in World War II. Yeah, well, to be fair, there was a section at the end of that air campaign where we only had to drop two, and suddenly Japan surrendered. Sorry. The Americans bombed every city and village, and they kept bombing until there were no major buildings left to destroy. Then they bombed the dams to flood the crops. The damage was unimaginable. Nobody knows how many civilians were killed and maimed. After the war, the North Korean government set up nursing centers for the disabled who had no families to care for them. One of these facilities in Onsong was where her grandfather met his future wife, Hwang Ok-soon. She was an orphan from a rural community in what was now South Korea, and her father had been a resistance fighter against Japan during Korea's colonial days. When she was 10 years old, he was arrested and never heard from again. After that, grandmother Huang, oh, Jesus Christ, this is a nice story, isn't it? When she was 10 years old, he was arrested, never heard from again. After that, grandmother Huang abandoned her family and ended up working as a farm laborer in Tumen, China. China, which was then part of the Japanese Empire. She returned to her home country after the Japanese surrendered and North and Korea gained independence. Unfortunately, she was living in the communist North when Korea was partitioned. In 1952, she was working at a munitions family in the port city of Chongjin on the East Sea when her leg was injured in a bombing raid and had to be amputated. Nursing facility to recover and learn to use her wooden leg. She was still young and single, but it was not likely that an able-bodied person would marry someone with a disability. So her best hope was to find a husband with a similar condition. That's kind of cute. My grandfather Bayon apparently had the same idea, and he was visiting nursing homes all over the northern provinces looking for a bride. The way she told this story, my grandfather saw him walking around the hallways and took pity on him. This man is in bad shape, she thought. If I don't marry him, he'll never find a wife. Oh, that is cute. They were wed shortly after the war ended, and she travelled 150 miles north with him, across the Chinese border to his home in Hunchun. By 1956, my grandmother was also pregnant with her first child, my mother's older sister. She was also miserable and homesick. Even though she had spent time in China, she never learned to speak Chinese, and she had a terrible craving for seafood, especially octopus, the way it is prepared in Chongjin. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore, and she left her husband behind while she went to find some octopus to eat. She could be an extremely emotional woman and very strong willed. When she made up her mind to do something, she could not be dissuaded. My grandfather had no choice but to follow her. Xiangjin was once a small fishing village, but the Japanese had turned it into an industrial port, and the North Korean government was rebuilding it as a major manufacturing and military center. My grandparents agreed it was no place to raise a family. They were both loyal followers of Kim Il sung, and they worried about the capitalistic tendencies in the border areas. They didn't want their children to be tempted by smuggling and other criminal activities. Yeah, because all seems to be going so well in the north. Bribe the policeman just so you can leave the city. They travelled south by rail to find a place to settle deep in the countryside. This was how my mother's family came to live in Kowon, a small city near a big agricultural river delta backed by rolling mountains. There were rice paddies and orchards, and none of the corrupting influences of the bustling border towns. It should have been a fresh start, but they came to Kowon at the time that Kim Il sung began purging North Korea of class. All citizens had to be investigated to determine their loyalty and record their songbook. Unfortunately, my grandmother was very truthful. Okay. And he told the investigator that his father was a landowner from Onsong. From then on, he was cursed with a bad songbun. There was no chance for him to join the party and get ahead in life. He was assigned a job in a button factory. My mother's older sister was born in Kowon in 1957, followed by three more children, two boys and then my mother, the youngest, who was born on July 16th, 1966. They all grew up to be loyal followers of the regime like their parents. My mother was an excellent student, a gifted singer, and a musician who accompanied herself on the accordion and guitar. In North Korean propaganda videos, you often see beautiful women dressed in traditional hanbok, the colourful jackets and high-waisted skirts that made them look like floating flowers, who sing such high and mournful songs that the audience burst into tears. That's what my mother did so well. When she was young, she wanted to perform professionally, but her teachers told her she had to study to go to university. Her father also discouraged a career as a performer. Instead, she concentrated on her studies and memorized a poetry praising the great leader and his son Kim Jong il, the chosen heir. It was unusual for a North Korean woman of her status to get a higher education, but my mother was such a good scholar that she was accepted at a college in the nearby city of Hamhung. If given a choice, she would have liked to have become a doctor, but only students from better families are allowed to say in what they study. The school administration decided she would major in inorganic chemistry, and that's what she did. When she graduated, party officials sent her back to Kowon to work in a chemical factory there. She was assigned a low-level job making ingredients for fragrances to put in soap and toothpaste. In a few months, she was allowed to switch to a better job at another factory that made clothes for export to the Soviet Union. Despite what others might call disappointments, she never questioned the regime's ability to control her life. Unlike North Koreans who grew up along the borders, my mother had no exposure to the outside world or foreign ideas. She only knew what the regime told her, and she remained a proud and pure revolutionary. And because she had a poet's heart, she felt an enormous emotional connection to the official propaganda. She sincerely believed that North Korea was the center of the universe, and that Kim Il sung and Kim Jong il had supernatural powers. She believed that Kim Il sung caused the sun to rise, and that when Kim Jong il was born in a cabin on our sacred Mount Paektu, he was actually born in Russia. His arrival was marked by a double rainbow and a bright new star in the sky. She was so brainwashed that when Kim Il sung died, she started to panic. It was like God himself had died. How can the Earth still spin on its axis, she wondered. The laws of physics she had studied in college were overcome by the propaganda that was drilled into her all her life. It would be many years before she realized that Kim Il sung and Kim Jong il were just men who had learned from Joseph Stalin, their Soviet role model, how to make people worship them like gods. Jesus Christ. Well, it's only 35 minutes. I suppose we could keep. Oh, actually, yeah, we've almost finished. Let's finish chapter 3. My mother was still living at home and working in the clothing factory when she met my father in the summer of 1989. I was 5 years old. It had been my father's habit to stay with her brother, Minsik, while he was conducting his black market business and so on. Since Minsik also lived with his parents, my mother and father saw each other quite often, but they didn't speak to each other except for polite greetings. There was no concept of dating in North Korea at that time. Our culture has always been extremely conservative about the relations between men and women. If you grew up in the West, you may think that romance occurs naturally, but it does not. You learn to be romantic from books and movies or from observation, but there was no model to learn from in my parents' time. They didn't even have the language to talk about their feelings. You just had to guess how your beloved felt from the look in his eyes, or the tone of her voice when she spoke to you. The most that they could do was hold hands secretly. I don't know what my father thought when he met my mother, but she must have been a beautiful sight. She was slender with strong limbs, high cheekbones, fine pale features. She also had a quick mind and a powerful will, which must have fascinated him. She was not that impressed with him. To her, he was ordinary looking and not very tall, but her brother Min Sik had told her that his friend was capable enough to take care of a wife. There's a saying for men like my father. He could survive even on bare rock, meaning he was resourceful and resilient no matter the circumstance. According to tradition, their marriage was arranged by their families. My grandfather Park accompanied my father on a selling trip to Kowal. They had decided it was safer to spread the risks between the two of them, so that neither would be carrying too many cigarettes or too much money when they were searched. When they arrived safely, they stayed with Min Sik and his family. When Grandfather Park quickly noticed my mother and saw her exchanging significant looks with his son, he sat down with my mother to discuss a match. My parents were judged by their families to be well suited. They both had a bag songman. As we say, you have to match swallow with swallow, magpie with magpie. In this case, bride and groom were both magpies. When the deal was done, Jinsik and Keosuk were told they were engaged. End of story. The wedding celebration was nothing special. My mother wore a traditional hanbok, and my father came to her parents' house, where there was a big table of food laid out for close family and friends. Then my mother took the train to Hyesan for a similar gathering at my father's house. There was no ceremony. My parents just brought their ID cards to the police station to record their marriage, and that was it. There is another Korean saying, the thread follows the needle. Usually the man is the needle and the thread is the woman, so the woman follows the husband to his home, but she does not take his name. For many women, it is the only independence that remains in their lives. And that's chapter 3 done. We're on chapter 4 now. Tears of Blood. Alright. Well, a lot of information there. She's obviously just recounting the story of where she came from by going through grandparents. And it seems that Korea was in its best time long before the Japanese showed up. They obviously had the problem with the Chinese and everything, but Korea spent a lot of time. It's one of those things that's like it's one of the bargaining chips of the world back in the day, because it was between bigger, greater, people and kings and lords. Like France, kind of some of the landlocked countries have this problem, like Poland, like Spain and Portugal were big. France was big. Germany's right next to them, and all these people were constantly warring. It's one thing England had, of course. We were separated by sea, which gave us something. Alright, I'm going to stop faffing about my hair. We're 40 minutes. We did 2 chapters. We'll hit chapter 4 next time. Take care, everyone.